We both spent the next few seconds staring intently at the only victim of collateral damage from that very brief and very one-sided exchange. An exchange which involved 25 very fast boys and one very well-protected, handcrafted suit of enchanted armor. A suit of armor who was an innocent victim in all of this, whose only offense was simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was an offense that had led to a hailstorm of bullets, creating an unsightly hole where a beefy neck guard had once been. This surprising turn of events had resulted in a very perplexed Sorosar, who seemed to be unable to make heads or tails of all of this. The man's gaze remained completely transfixed on what could only be described as a clean textbook example of a shot grouping made possible by a tried and proven weapon with centuries of refinement under its belt. The thumb-sized hole that had manifested on a particularly heavily reinforced part of the armor looked almost surreal given the otherwise immaculate state of the suit. It looked almost intentional, almost mockingly so, and would have more than likely been immediately attributed to a great many forms of manifold shenanigans, rather than the unassuming mannerless brick that was my pistol. After a few more moments of silence, punctuated only by an awkward shuffle, as the man knelt down to get a closer look at the damage, he eventually turned to face me again with a clenched fist, and a single thumb pointed back towards the hole in question. "So, mannerless?" he asked, with a genuine display of disbelief, as if needing to hear me say it one last time, to douse what few embers remained of his lingering skepticism. A skepticism which I only had one response for, that being a confident nod and a sheepish smile. "Yup, mannerless." A sharp sigh soon followed, as the armourer wiggled his hands in place for a few seconds, causing two back-to-back upticks in mana radiation. "Alert. Localized surge of mana radiation detected. 200% above background radiation levels." The lights in the room suddenly dimmed. "Alert. Localized surge of mana radiation detected. 230% above background radiation levels." And an object suddenly appeared in the armourer's formerly empty hands. An object which bore a remarkable similarity to a flashlight, if you were to replace the butt of it with a dull pulsating orb of light encased in a spinning disc of crystals. It looked like something you'd find in an endgame dungeon, despite its sole purpose being identical to that of your common requisitions office-grade flashlight. The purpose of this device, and the sudden dimming of the workshop's lights, was soon made clear to me as he pointed the light through the hole in the armour, only for it to emerge on the other side seamlessly. "Because you've left me with not just one hole to worry about, but two, and as a result left me with double the questions, double the perplexity, and double the mystery, as to how a mannerless projectile was able to make it through enchanted armour not just once, but twice." Sorosar reinforced his sheer and utter disbelief by rapidly flicking the bottom of the magical flashlight with his fingers, causing the light to turn on and off in rapid succession. A very apt metaphor for how he was currently feeling at this point, no doubt. "The armour, despite being enchanted, is still just steel, correct?" I responded, with a straightforward question. "Mana steel, yes, but I'll assume your point still stands," the armourer responded curtly. "And I'm assuming there's no additional funny business involved? No enchantments that can repel projectiles? No shields that slows down incoming blows or anything like that?" I continued further. "Not this particular piece, no. It's a commission from the same person who commissioned the polearm. All he wanted, and all he was allowed, was a series of complex enchantments designed to strengthen the mana steel. Resilience, durability, and other such assorted enchantments," the armourer listed off in rapid succession. With it being confirmed that all I was dealing with was just a super strengthened piece of metal, I was confident in leading into my final point. "Well, theoretically speaking then, even with enchantments, anything with enough mass, travelling with enough speed, could pierce an object, correct?" The armourer made a point to cock his head to the other side, and if he still had eyes, I bet they'd be staring at me with all sorts of emotions right about now. The speed an object would need to achieve to pierce a piece of enchanted armor, not once, but twice, would be impossible to accomplish without the aid of the direct manipulation of mana, or the construction of an artifice using mana, Yarmara stated plainly, with a hint of disbelief colouring his voice. No manaless mechanism would be able to accomplish a similar end. This is not to mention that the object in question would have to be shaped with the explicit purpose to pierce mana steel, and would have to be forged out of a material with properties comparable to mana steel, if not exceeding it. The man paused after that spiel for a few seconds, his whole body going completely still, as he began mumbling to himself. A smart smith would have to weigh the cost and benefit of the velocity versus the weight of the projectile, and the energy capable of being transferred at the point of impact. Moreover, different shapes designed to pierce certain armors, and the properties of the metals involved, would also come into play, which, given the back-and-forth nature of arms and defense, all of this would imply... His mumbles stopped as he rapidly cocked his head towards the hole yet again, then towards me. Just how far has your realm come, where your people have found it necessary to develop projectiles, capable of piercing materials comparable to enchanted mana steel, Emma Booker? The armourer spoke with nothing but shock and disbelief in his voice. Far enough, I spoke vaguely, as I knew I had to tread the line between discretion and answers like a thread through a needle. The armourer let out a sharp humph at my answer, before continuing. I shouldn't be surprised, though. I should have expected as much, given how that small weapon of yours was capable of containing a chain of consecutive explosions. The armourer spoke in no uncertain terms, as I felt my heart practically skipping a beat. That's what it was, wasn't it? That dreadful sound? I've dabbled in my fair share of explosive weaponry. I know the sound of a contained explosion when I hear one. I paused, trying to wrap my head around an acceptable answer, as I landed on a plausible, middling response. Only to be cut off by the armourer before I could go anywhere with that. Actually, don't answer that question, he urged sharply, as he craned his head towards several aspects of the room, before landing on the entryway to the workshop. It was the same tone he'd used when he'd hurriedly approved my weapon and prematurely ended the weapons inspection, right before Eleanor's prank. It was that same, almost hushed sort of self-conscious intonation that felt just a bit off from the endlessly curious tone he usually spoke in. It would be rude of me to intrude and to blindly ask for something that might well be a trade secret of another smithy, or armory after all, he quickly added, clearly attempting to justify that abrupt halt in his curious train of thought by giving me an answer that was just convincing enough, but still left me with a certain sense of unease. Another awkward silence soon descended on us. Something was clearly going through Sorosar's head, something that the man clearly didn't want to say or mention out loud. The way he stood there, just glancing back and forth between me and the hole-ridden suit of armour, made me think there was more to this sudden stop in the flow of the conversation, and more to the abrupt cut-off of his naturally curious tendencies. Don't interpret this the wrong way, Emma Booker, he suddenly spoke up. I want nothing more than to dive deeper into the inner workings of such a fascinating weapon. However, I believe it's best if certain things were left unspoken. I wouldn't want to rescind my earlier approval of that weapon, after all. The man spoke with a wink, or what could be interpreted as a wink, as he tilted his helmet back and forth enough to generate that same effect. That one statement alone was evidence enough to prove to me that the armourer was actively trying to help. There were 1,001 ways this could have played out, and 100,000 more scenarios where he could have just taken the pistol away. Yet this was one of those outcomes where that wasn't the case. Perhaps the hearts and minds aspect of this whole mission was already starting to pay off. Either way, I believe it's about time you took your leave, Emma Booker. I said it before, but I'll say it again. I've taken enough of your time as it is. Sorosar spoke with a grandfatherly warmth. And unlike myself, I know there's a fleshy body inside of that armor that needs its sleep. It didn't feel right to just leave it at that, though. I felt like I had to clear the air somewhat, especially with how things had panned out, and especially after all of the acts of goodwill Sorosar had risked his own skin just to put forward. Listen, Sorosar, I'm sorry about how things turned out tonight.
Oh? Whatever do you mean by that, Imabuka? The man spoke with his signature head tilt.
The way he spoke was completely devoid of any duplicity or sarcasm, but instead a genuine sense of confusion. It's just, well, first of all, I'm sorry for this entire mess. I gestured at the room. Though to be fair, the mess I was referring to was almost completely gone now, as whatever magic was responsible for cleaning everything up had made short work of the disaster Eleanor had left behind.
First off, none of this was your mess to begin with, Imabuka, the armorer replied with absolutely no hesitation. And second, it's a relatively trivial matter for a caster of my caliber to deal with, as you see.
He gestured towards the scant few objects that were slowly making their way back to their rightful places.
The workshop's practically as good as new now.
Well, I most certainly can't argue with that, I responded with a sigh. But I still feel somewhat responsible for the damage. I gestured towards the hole-ridden suit of armor in question. If I hadn't used my weapon on that fake creature, then...
You can't feel mana fields underneath all that mana-resistant metal, can you, Imabuka?
The armorer interjected with a question. No, not really. At least not as I understand how most Nexians can.
Well then, you're not at fault, the armorer stated in no uncertain terms. The projection you saw was as accurate as could be, down to the finest physical details, and even took up physical space. However, it was his mana field that gave it away. It wasn't that it was undetectable, but rather it was a rough approximation that was simply incongruent with the creature it was purporting to be. Given what you've told me, that you're from a realm without mana, belonging to a species without a mana field, it would have been all but impossible for you to have distinguished that beastly projection from its real counterpart. Come to think of it, even a peasant with the ability to detect mana wouldn't have been able to detect the finer details of its falsehood, as the field it projected was there, but just not right.
If that's the case, then that might explain why the sensors were fooled. It wasn't that it was a hologram, it was an actual physical thing. Which again, brings up the uncomfortable question of just how Eleanor was able to capture the Gnoll's likeness, down to a T. The ability to feel and see mana fields sounds almost like an extra sense, I pondered out loud.
That it is, Imabuka. Or rather, it's a sense that's found in all living things in the Nexus, and the adjacent realms. I wouldn't want to sound presumptuous, but considering you are unable to sense it at all, you technically are the exception to the rule. Apologies if that was in any way offensive, the armorer responded sheepishly.
No offense taken, Sorosar. I promptly dismissed the man's concerns and reassured him with a firm nod. There was a lot to unpack and uncover here, and a heck of a lot more things to learn. But for now, I needed to wrap things up. There would be time to delve deeper into the finer details of mana, into whatever Sorosar seemed to be paranoid of, and into Eleanor's conspiracy. Probably not in that order, but still. There would be a time and place for them. For now, the primary concern was to finally bring this questline to an end, before shifting my entire focus back on resuming the hunt for the crate. I'm not too great at goodbyes, so I guess this is it. At least until we inevitably bump into each other again. I do have a whole year to spend here after all, I spoke under an exasperated breath.
Indeed, and several more years following that to boot, so fret not, young cadet, for we will soon cross paths yet again. I just know it, Sorosar replied cheerfully. Oh, and before I forget...
The man outstretched a hand towards the general direction of the damaged suit of armor. Alert! Localized surge of mana radiation detected. 270% above background radiation levels. And telekinetically pulled out what seemed to be a collection of bits of metal, deep from within the stone wall behind it.
Here are your projectiles back,
he spoke giddily, as he clinked the bits and pieces of metal around in his gloved palms.
Such fascinating specimens.
Before reluctantly pouring all of them back onto my awaiting hands.
Please send my regards to Dr. Alison Cooper and Dr. Richard Lee for the invention and/or refinement of such novel constructs.
Another sharp shiver ran down my spine as the armourer spoke of the two long-dead engineers, clearly working off of the assumptions from my purposely vague explanation of the gun from earlier. I'll see what I can do about that. The pair are, normally quite preoccupied. Dr. Cooper, Dr. Lee, please don't haunt my dreams for this. I did what I had to, I whispered internally to myself, and to the long-departed spirits of the two world-renowned engineers, who were more than likely now waiting for me with rolled-up newspapers for when it was my turn to join them in the afterlife. And thank you for returning these, I said, as I pocketed the bullets, or what was left of them, back into one of my many pouches. It was at this point that Sorosar began ushering me towards the double doors, but continued talking as he accompanied me out.
You're more than welcome to return to the workshop at any point, Emma Booker. However, there are a few caveats you must be aware of. As you might have overheard from our confrontation with the Venerian, the workshop is generally off-limits to students. This means that you would normally have to go through the faculty to request an audience with me. However, I would request that you actively avoid the conventional channels, should you wish to return. You can instead approach the workshop directly, though you must first inform one of my many golems that line the hallway first. They will inform me of your presence, and we can proceed from there.
The man paused, placing a hand on my shoulder, just as we reached the double doors.
Make sure that you address the golems and not the gargoyles, he quickly added.
Will do, Sorosar, I nodded cautiously, and soon after left the workshop in almost the same way I entered, without much fanfare, and with dread looming ahead of me. However, as I turned back towards the doors one final time, waving the man yet another goodbye, that sense of dread lifted somewhat. My time with Sorosar had exposed a revelation far more vital than the intel I'd managed to gather on the offensive capabilities and the industrial potential of the Nexus. It had exposed something that should have been obvious from the beginning, but that I now had more evidence for. It had demonstrated the fact that the Academy, and perhaps by extension the Nexus, wasn't just a monolithic faceless threat. Because, as with any institution, it was composed of people, and people tended to vary wildly in possibly every possible metric, as evidenced by Sorosar himself. I'd arrived at the workshop believing I was in for an uphill battle, believing that the armourer would be yet another Nexus shill, yet the man I encountered was anything but. As I was instead faced with a near-broken man who perhaps suffered just as much as any under the system he served. My interactions with Sorosar were forcing me to rethink my current presumptions over the Academy. It gave me some hope that there was good here, underneath what would otherwise be a gilded world in name alone. Dragon's Heart Tower, Level 23, Residence 30, Living Room, Local Time, 0300 hours, Emma Booker. They say that you don't really notice how tired you are until you finally reach the finish line. Well, whoever they are, they're right. I wanted nothing more than to drop dead. I desired sleep. I craved rest. My body screamed at me to just lie where I stood as I entered through those double doors and back into the sanctuary that was the dorm. Yet rest would not come for me that easy. Indeed, I knew that my night had only just begun, at least when it came to the long laundry list that came with the setup of the tent. Looking at the top right-hand corner of the hut, I physically shuddered when I saw the looming horror that came second only to the null with the level of primal dread it installed within me. It was a feeling that was well known within the ranks of anyone trained in expeditionary warfare, a sense of inevitability that would have made even the most hardened of veterans quake in their boots. For this was an enemy that you couldn't just dispatch with, at least not with a bullet, a laser beam or a bolt of plasma. It was an enemy that you could only deal with using a squad of auto-assembly drones, and a lot of troubleshooting. It was the dreaded checklist. In front of my eyes, superimposed in front of the dark and silent room, like the spectre of a freshly minted sapper, was the monster of a checklist that grew larger and larger in size the longer my pupils remained fixated on it. Ongoing tasks, tent. Basic setup, 72%. Intermediate setup, 34%. Advanced setup, 23%. Setup of internal facilities, not available. Setup of external perimeter equipment, 10%. Eventually, the text came to dominate the majority of my vision, not out of some quirk of the interface, but because it was necessary for what was to come. Menu expansion, yes or no? Because within those categories was nestled a collapsible menu that held an endless stream of subcategories. And within those were the individual tasks arranged in order of priority, colour-coded with its prerequisite equipment and materials, and further married with a series of 100 different bits and pieces that were by themselves fine, but when put together, looked like an info logger had thrown up on my HUD. Because in expeditionary warfare, the only ones responsible for your bed, your shower, your facilities, is you. I began recalling some of my aunt's many warnings about heading voluntarily into expeditionary training and certification. That's why I joined the TSEC proper. All you need to worry about is your kit, your weapons, the insertion, and killing anything outlined in red. Everything else is not my problem. Join the LREF if you want to spend half of your time training how to prepare for a hypothetical alien war on a hypothetical alien world by not hypothetically assembling bases from the ground up over and over again. Join the army if you want to roll the dice on whether or not you plan on doing the same thing the LREF does, just with less prestige, or end up being stuck on base for the entirety of your service. If only she could see what I'd gotten myself into now. I sighed, and began looking around for any signs of life. All I could see, however, was a room with only the crackling fireplace as its sole source of light. It was quiet, somewhat eerie, but very peaceful. I kinda liked that. Some peace after a day of non-stop action was nice. At least, that's what I thought, until I heard the telltale signs of life from within Thalman's and Eleanor's room. A series of loud thumps grew in rapid succession, as if someone was purposely stomping on either the floors, or even the walls, given how erratic things sounded from this side of the wall. I knew it wasn't my business to involve myself in other people's business, but heck, I couldn't help myself. So I took a few tentative steps towards the room, which was more than enough for me to hear bits and pieces of the vitriolic argument spring within.
I'm not going to ask again. Where the heck were you, lizard?
I heard a very distinct voice growl out. Thalman's voice, no doubt, as the EV began filtering the audio, amplifying it, and assigning names to the voices for good measure. Where I was is none of your concern, Lupinor. I find your obsessive interest over my actions to be quite telling, mercenary prince. You don't seem to have much in the way of your own business to attend to now, do you? Perhaps you find it more engaging to live vicariously through another's eyes. Is that what it is? The small thing was just as smarmy as ever.
You know damn well that's not what this is about. Now stop skirting my questions. You expect to arrive back here, enter our room, without even giving me the common courtesy of an explanation why you left in the first place. Is that how manners go in your kingdom?
I'll be having none of this. Not tonight. Wait. Just a moment. Alert. Localized surge of mana radiation detected. 225% above background radiation levels. Any and all sounds from within the room suddenly stopped after that burst of mana. I could only assume that the lizard had more than likely pulled up another privacy banner. Good luck, Thalman. You're going to need it, I whispered silently into my helmet, as I left the wolf to his fate, and silently trudged back towards my room. I'd done everything in my power to delay the inevitable. Now it was time to face the music. Opening the door to the room, I was met with silence. Not the dull droning of the generators, nor the vacuum-like whirring of the MREDD, but just silence. Taking more tentative steps towards the tent, it soon became clear just why things were this silent. Alert. Localized surge of mana radiation detected. 275% above background radiation levels. Thacia had clearly accounted for the noise, and decided to preemptively deal with it before I even got back. My suspicions were confirmed as I looked up towards the second floor lofts and noticed that one of the beds was already occupied. "Thank you, Thacia. You really are a lifesaver," I thought to myself with a smile, as I prodded my way over to what looked to be a massive food cart just randomly placed in a corner of the room. It was only when I got close did I realize what it was, and it was only then that a huge pang of hunger finally hit me. It was the go-to order I'd requested earlier this morning at breakfast. I completely forgot about it with everything else that had happened over the course of the day. From the spy drone to the revelation of the null, to the library and the subsequent fight that ensued in the gardens, to the discussions of the gun to both Thacia and Thaumin, and then the whole night spent at the armourer's workshop. The food cart had all but been ejected from my mind. Looking at the massive cart, I noticed a small letter, written in handwriting that looked as if it had come straight off a table of a master calligrapher. The Eevee and the translation suites made quick work of the text as I began reading it. "Emma, you will find that the food is still in the same condition as it was this morning, as the Academy utilizes a spell to ensure the freshness of the dishes. Please find the time to eat something. Your lack of appetite is starting to worry me. With sincerest regards, Thacia D." I couldn't help but to feel a certain pang of something at the end of that letter. I couldn't quite place it, but it just felt nice. Though as I stared at the still fresh food, I quickly realized that it could only help so much, given that I'd forgotten to put it in the MREDD earlier in the day. And since the machine hadn't yet been tested and needed several samples to calibrate, I knew I wouldn't be seeing any of these dishes inside the tent, at least until sometime tomorrow. With that being said, I needed to put something in there now if I wanted to see results. So I took a few staple foods that were of similar densities, that being some bread and what looked to be pancakes, and tossed those into the MREDD's external-facing compartment. With that out of the way, I turned to the rest of the equipment still tucked away in the crates. I stared at them for a few solid minutes, my fingers gliding across my tablet, as I finally landed on something that satisfied both the checklist and my own selfish desires. It was going to be a long shot, but I knew I could do it. This would be something I would need if I was going to stand any chance of resuming my quest to retrieve the crate, starting with an unscheduled visit to a, hopefully, lucid apprentice. Start setup. Hygiene module. Yes? No. I was going to take a warm shower tonight, if it was the last thing I'd do.